The story of the last days and burial of the Reverend J. Hudson Taylor, as told by Mrs. Howard Taylor, Mrs. K.P. Shapley, that's S-H-A-P-L-E-I-G-H, and Dr. H.G. Barrie, that's B-A-R-R-I-E. Also an appreciation by the Reverend J.W. Stevenson, Deputy Director in China. J. Hudson Taylor, the beloved founder and director of the China Inland Mission, born 1832, died 1905. The closing hours. Extracts from a private letter from Dr. H.G. Barrie. Hanoi, June 3, 1905. Today at 8:30 p.m., Mr. Hudson Taylor passed from our midst into the presence of Him whom he served so faithfully and well in China for nearly 52 years. His passing was a happy, rapid, and peaceful transition. We had seen much of him during his brief stay here. He took such an interest in everything, and inevitably wished to be where the rest were. I was struck with his disinclination for solitude. He rested much in the little sitting room. Since arriving, he had not felt quite equal to going out into the chapel and facing the assembly there, but only this morning, at the conclusion of regular prayers, he had made a special effort and was assisted out to the platform. The members looked happy and sympathetic as they watched his feeble movements. They stood up as he entered and made his way to the reading desk. It was a very simple yet deep message that he spoke as he leaned heavily on the railing, and while given in much physical weakness, will not soon be forgotten by those of us privileged to hear his voice and look into his radiant face. Mr. Taylor, later in the afternoon, spent a happy time meeting the Shaanxi missionaries socially. He gave utterance to many expressions of devout thankfulness as he heard about and saw the abundant entrance the gospel now has in the capital of this once anti-foreign providence. The guests left at 6 o'clock. I then assisted Mr. Taylor up to his room and sat talking with him for half an hour while waiting the preparation of a little early supper prior to going to the north end of the city. While we sat talking, a very beautiful incident occurred. Mr. Taylor arose and went to the other end of the room, and getting 2 fans, handed me one. And when I remonstrated with him for not asking me to get them for him, replied, "I wanted to get you one." This thoughtfulness, in spite of his age and feebleness, had been very noticeable and very beautiful. We were speaking of the privilege of bringing everything to God in prayer, and I remarked that the distinction between small and great things frequently came into my mind and heart at times of prayer. His answer was that he did not know anything about it. Then, after a pause of some moments, he said, "There is nothing small, and there is nothing great. Only God is great, and we should trust Him fully." He appeared to be a little concerned as to whether or not his son had made arrangements to have the baggage taken to the steamer, in order to avoid any Sunday confusion or work. And as I left him, he went to his son's room. When supper was ready, Mr. Taylor wished to have his in the quietness of his own room, rather than downstairs as usual. Dr. Taylor had taken it up, and as his father had no immediate desire to partake of it, he assisted him to bed and left him comfortably resting. In a few minutes, Mrs. Taylor went to her father's room, and drawing a chair to his bedside, chatted with him and coaxed him to take his supper, as he had not yet taken a morsel of it. Suddenly she noticed that Mr. Taylor's breathing became radically altered. One quick grasp was followed by 3 or 4 fleeting sighs, and then he was motionless. Mrs. Taylor ran to the top of the staircase, and in a suppressed voice called to Dr. Taylor, who came at once. Dr. Keller, who had just returned from the steamer, where he had taken the baggage, was then called up, and together they tried artificial respiration, but without avail. The beloved one had already passed into the Lord's presence. Almost instantaneously, the lines left his face. An expression of deep rest and peace reigned there. The workers and the evangelists from the 2 new outstations had all arrived early in the day to see Mr. Taylor, and these and other friends requested to view the body. It was touching to hear Mr. W-H-A-N-G, the new worker at TONG-SAN, when he asked to see Mr. Taylor's body, and then asked permission to touch his hand. As he stroked the cold form, he said, "Dear and honored Pastor, you have loved the Chinese, and we love you. You have gone on before us, and we will follow on too." After this, the house servants crept up in single file and looked upon his face, and felt they had a peculiar right to do so. Plans had to be arranged without loss of time in view of the hot weather, and the desire to take the remains to Chin-Kiang to be laid beside his first wife. A number of telegrams were sent off immediately, and 2 of the evangelists were dispatched to secure a coffin. After a considerable delay, a very desirable one was purchased, in spite of the lateness of the hour. It was a beautiful sight to see the Chinese Christians performing the last offices over the remains of their friend. With skillful and loving hands, they prepared his body after the Chinese method, and a highly commendable method it is, in the chapel where only a few hours before he had met them with such evident pleasure. By the time all was complete, it was 3:30 a.m., Sunday, June 4th. The little funeral cortege almost immediately left the chapel for the riverside. Leading was the coffin with its 8 bearers. Then followed Dr. Taylor's party, and to the rear the church members who had been assisting throughout the night and early morning. It had been raining, and the narrow streets were very wet and dark, and were lighted only by paper lanterns carried by the bearers. The steamer lay in midstream, and it was necessary to secure a large sampan in order to reach it. The remains were deposited in this, and his friends gathered about them in a boat. We were soon on board the steamer, and after a brief farewell, we left our departing friends with their precious burden, ready to leave at daybreak for Hankow. God had arranged wonderfully about the steamer. Its regular time of departure was on Sunday morning, but on Saturday the steamer office was wired, asking permission to have it wait until early Monday. This would give Mr. Taylor an opportunity to spend Sunday here, and late in the evening they could all go on board. With this in view, the baggage had been taken down early on Saturday evening. Now that Mr. Taylor had been called home, the captain, who had received instructions from Hankow to wait till Monday, was gladly consented to leave at the usual time. Hence the necessity for the midnight preparations. The captain's sympathy and his special care to make everything as convenient as possible was greatly appreciated. Dr. and Mrs. Howard Taylor, Miss J. It's A.F. and then Sandberg, and Dr. Guinness accompanied the remains to Hankow. During the evening's preparation, these dear friends exhibited great fortitude and peacefulness. Their special relief and delight was in prayer. Early in the evening, just after the 2 evangelists had set out to find a suitable casket, Dr. and Mrs. Taylor suggested that we have special prayer, that they might be prospered, as the hour was late, and it was raining heavily, and the coolies would be most difficult to secure. The occasion was also a time of very real drawing near to God in behalf of the members of the bereaved families in China and elsewhere, and also for the Chinese. Just as the Christians had completed the preparations, we foreigners gathered in the sitting room, and prayer was made, especially by the visitors, in behalf of the home and station. Then, as we gathered in the chapel ready for our journey through the wet streets to the riverside, Evangelist Li, that's L.I., offered prayer on behalf of the Chinese and asked that no accident might befall us en route to the steamer. The Chinese were very anxious to provide the coffin. Dr. Taylor endeavored to persuade them not to undertake so great a burden, but they remained firm and, much to their joy, had their own way. Saturday evening, June 4th. 2 short hours' rest early this morning has not proved the best preparation for a busy day, and especially after the several busy days we have had. All, including the servants, look quite exhausted. Dr. Keller and the hastily planned memorial service for the Chinese quite broke down in speaking. Following this, a baptism service was held, and 8 new members were received. Though all were weary, all looked as though things could never be quite the same again, for in some gracious way we have all felt that God has been particularly near, and it has been a real privilege to minister to his servant, Mr. Taylor. Many years ago, Mr. Taylor said that when he once saw Hongning, that's H-U-N-A-N, opened up, his life work would be ended. How beautifully it had all been arranged. He had spent a few weeks and seen other parts which were upon his heart, and finally came into H-U-N-A-N. Here in the heart of China, after meeting representative missionaries of the Providence, he went, as Dr. McGinnis said, from the heart of China to the heart of God. He had no further plans after leaving here, beyond going via Toronto and Canada to Switzerland, where he said to me last evening, "I want to see my wife's grave." His work and his life were completed at this point, in accordance with his hopes and prayers for many years. He did not die in any other way, or for any other reason than that God fulfilled his servant's wish, and God took him to be with himself. And how fitting was the concluding scene, in which the people he loved, and among whom he died, should prepare his body for its long journey to its final resting place on the threshold of a once closed land. This is being read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. These are not numbered chapters. This has been the first chapter